Picture walking into a medieval church on a Sunday morning. The floor beneath your feet isn't solid stone, but a patchwork of memorial slabs covering hundreds of bodies buried just inches below. The air carries the faint but persistent odor of decay, masked by incense and prayers. Children play games by hopping between grave markers while their parents pray above the bones of strangers. Beneath the altar, in the most sacred space, lie the remains of saints, nobles and wealthy merchants, who paid enormous sums for the privilege of eternal proximity to holy relics. Why did medieval people choose to worship surrounded by the dead? What drove them to transform their churches into elaborate necropolises that mixed the sacred and the macabre in ways that would horrify modern congregations? The answer lies in medieval beliefs about death, salvation, and the geography of the afterlife that made physical location after death a matter of eternal importance. Medieval Christians believed that burial site directly influenced the soul's journey to heaven, making proximity to holy places and saintly remains essential for achieving salvation. They created a complex theology of death that turned church burial into both spiritual necessity and social competition, transforming places of worship into some of the most densely packed burial grounds in human history. Medieval church burial began with early Christian beliefs about resurrection and the importance of holy ground for ensuring proper passage to the afterlife. Church authorities taught that bodies buried in consecrated soil would be among the first to rise during the final judgment, while those interred in ordinary ground faced uncertain prospects for salvation. This theological framework created enormous demand for church burial space that far exceeded the physical capacity of medieval buildings. The most coveted burial locations were ad sanctos, literally near the saints, where proximity to holy relics promised intercession and protection during the vulnerable journey between death and judgment. Churches competed to acquire saints' relics specifically to attract wealthy patrons who would pay premium prices for burial near these sacred remains. The resulting market in holy bones created a thriving economy where spiritual benefits were literally bought and sold to the highest bidders. But here's where medieval church burial becomes truly fascinating. It wasn't just about individual salvation, but about creating eternal communities that reflected earthly social hierarchies. The church floor became a three-dimensional map of medieval society, with burial locations indicating wealth, social status, and spiritual worth. The altar area housed saints, kings, and the highest-ranking clergy. The nave accommodated nobles, wealthy merchants, and important civic officials. The churchyard received ordinary parishioners who could afford basic burial fees. The economics of church burial created sophisticated pricing systems that maximized revenue while maintaining social distinctions. Prime locations near altars and saints' tombs commanded enormous fees equivalent to several years' wages for ordinary workers. Standard nave burials cost substantial but manageable amounts for prosperous artisans and merchants. Churchyard graves required modest payments within reach of most community members. These pricing structures ensured that death maintained the same social stratification as life. Wealthy families invested enormous resources in securing advantageous burial locations that would benefit multiple generations. They purchased family crypts, endowed perpetual masses for their souls, and commissioned elaborate monuments that proclaimed their status for posterity. Some noble families spent more on burial arrangements than they had invested in their living accommodations, viewing church burial as the most important purchase they would ever make. The physical challenges of church burial required ingenious solutions that pushed medieval engineering and sanitation practices to their limits. Churches needed sufficient floor space to accommodate dozens or hundreds of graves while maintaining structural integrity and aesthetic appeal. They developed techniques for layering burials vertically, creating multi-story underground necropolises that maximized capacity within limited space. Medieval church builders designed specialized drainage systems that channeled decomposition fluids away from living areas while preserving the building's foundation. They created ventilation systems that minimized odors during services and developed architectural features that incorporated burial functions into worship spaces. Churches became complex structures that balanced religious requirements with the practical necessities of mass burial. The logistics of church burial required careful planning and coordination between religious authorities, construction specialists, and funeral service providers. Sextons developed systematic approaches to grave location and maintenance. Grave diggers specialized in working within confined church spaces, using techniques that minimize disruption to ongoing religious activities. Funeral directors coordinated complex ceremonies that honored the dead while accommodating the needs of large congregations. But the most challenging aspect of church burial involved managing the health consequences of concentrated decomposition in occupied buildings. Medieval people understood that buried bodies created odors and health risks, but they viewed these problems as acceptable trade-offs for spiritual benefits. They developed mitigation strategies that reduced but never eliminated the sanitary challenges of worshipping above mass graves. Churches used liberal amounts of incense, herbs and perfumes to mask odors during services. They scheduled burials and exhumations to minimize disruption during important religious festivals. Some churches developed rotation systems where different areas were used for burial, while others remained sealed to allow decomposition to proceed undisturbed. These practical accommodations allowed church burial to continue despite obvious health risks. The seasonal rhythm of medieval church burial reflected the relationship between mortality patterns and religious calendar requirements. Winter deaths were often stored in temporary facilities until spring ground thaw allowed proper burial. Summer deaths required immediate interment to prevent rapid decomposition in occupied buildings. Plague outbreaks created crisis situations where normal burial procedures became impossible, and emergency mass graves challenged theological requirements for individual consecrated burial. Guild systems extended to funeral services and church burial, with professional organizations controlling access to burial trades and maintaining standards for funeral conduct. Gravedigger guilds established pricing, training requirements, and jurisdictional boundaries that determined who could work in specific churches. Funeral provider guilds created standardized service packages and maintained quality control that ensured appropriate treatment of wealthy customers. The most prestigious church burial positions were often held by guild members whose services to religious institutions earned them coveted burial rights. Master craftsmen who built church altars, created religious artwork, or provided essential maintenance services received burial privileges that reflected their professional contributions. These arrangements created incentive systems that encouraged high-quality work on religious projects. Religious authorities faced constant pressure to balance spiritual obligations with practical limitations when managing church burial programs. Canon law required that they provide burial services for all baptized Christians, but church capacity and maintenance costs created economic pressures that favored wealthy customers. They developed complex theological justifications for charging burial fees and restricting access to premium locations. Some religious orders specialized in burial services and operated churches specifically designed to accommodate large numbers of intimates. These institutions developed expertise in embalming, tomb construction, and funeral ceremony management that attracted customers from wide geographical areas. They became centers of innovation in burial technology and funeral service delivery that influenced practices across medieval Europe. The relationship between church burial and monastery economics created mutually beneficial arrangements that supported both institutions. Wealthy families endowed monasteries with burial rights that provided steady income for religious communities. Monks provided perpetual prayer services for buried patrons, while using burial revenues to support charitable activities and religious education. These partnerships created sustainable financial models that supported both spiritual and practical community needs. Urban church burial faced unique challenges from population density, limited space, and competing demands for prime religious real estate. City churches developed vertical burial systems that maximized capacity through careful engineering and architectural innovation. They created underground burial chambers, multi-level crypt systems, and roof-mounted burial gardens that expanded capacity beyond conventional floor space. The competition for urban church burial space led to innovative solutions that would astonish modern cemetery planners. Some city churches constructed elaborate underground galleries that extended far beyond the building's footprint, creating vast subterranean networks of burial chambers connected by stone corridors. These underground cities of the dead featured separate sections for different social classes, family crypts that could accommodate dozens of relatives, and even underground chapels where families could hold private memorial services. The most ingenious urban burial innovation involved the development of rotating burial systems, where bodies were temporarily interred until decomposition was complete, then exhumed and moved to charnel houses, or bone crypts to make room for new burials. This system allowed churches to serve far more customers than their physical space would normally accommodate, while maintaining the spiritual benefits of consecrated burial. Charnel houses became architectural features in their own right, with elaborate displays of skulls and bones arranged in decorative patterns that reminded visitors of mortality while maximizing storage efficiency. Professional bone keepers emerged as specialized workers who managed these rotation systems, maintaining detailed records of which remains belonged to which families and ensuring that bones were properly preserved and respectfully displayed. These specialists developed sophisticated techniques for identifying individual remains, creating memorial systems that honored the dead while accommodating the practical necessities of limited space. Their work required both technical expertise and diplomatic skills, as families often disputed the handling of their ancestors' remains. The psychological challenges of worshipping surrounded by death created unique spiritual practices that helped medieval congregations cope with constant reminders of mortality. Churches developed special liturgies that acknowledged the presence of the dead and incorporated their memory into regular worship services. Priests learned to balance celebration of resurrection with acknowledgement of death's reality, creating religious experiences that were simultaneously comforting and sobering. Children growing up in these environments developed different relationships with death than modern youngsters experience. They played games that incorporated grave markers as natural playground equipment, learned prayers specifically for the souls of those buried beneath their feet, and absorbed attitudes about mortality that prepared them for lives where death was a constant companion. These childhood experiences shaped medieval personalities in ways that influenced everything from career choices to marriage decisions to personal risk assessment. Rural church burial reflected different social dynamics and resource constraints that shaped burial practices in agricultural communities. Village churches served smaller populations with less economic stratification, creating more egalitarian burial patterns. However, rural churches also faced challenges from seasonal accessibility, limited professional funeral services, and greater reliance on community cooperation for burial maintenance. Rural communities developed innovative approaches to church burial that maximized community participation while minimizing costs. Families took turns providing burial services, with different households responsible for grave digging, funeral feasts, and memorial maintenance on rotating schedules. These cooperative systems created strong social bonds while ensuring that even poor families could access the spiritual benefits of church burial. The agricultural calendar influenced rural burial practices in ways that urban communities didn't experience. Harvest seasons limited availability of workers for funeral services, while winter weather often delayed burials until spring thaw made grave digging possible. Rural churches developed storage systems for preserving bodies during these delays, creating temporary preservation techniques that allowed proper burial to occur when conditions permitted. The decline of church burial resulted from changing religious beliefs, public health awareness, and urban development pressures that made the practice increasingly problematic. Protestant Reformation theology challenged Catholic teachings about salvation through burial location. Renaissance medical knowledge revealed health risks that medieval people had accepted as divine will. Urban growth created space pressures that made church burial economically inefficient. However, the transition from church burial to cemetery burial occurred gradually over several centuries, with many communities maintaining traditional practices well into the modern period. Some churches continued to offer burial services for wealthy patrons who valued traditional arrangements. Religious authorities developed compromise solutions that honored theological requirements while addressing practical concerns about public health and space limitations. Medieval church burial practices established precedents for modern cemetery design, funeral service delivery, and commemorative traditions that continue to influence contemporary death culture. The emphasis on permanent memorialization, professional funeral services, and social stratification through burial location evolved directly from medieval church burial systems. The integration of religious ceremony with burial services remains central to modern funeral practices across many cultures. The economic models developed for church burial created templates for modern funeral industry business practices. The pricing structures, service packages, and professional organizations that characterized medieval church burial evolved into contemporary funeral service systems. The recognition that burial services could be both spiritual comfort and profitable business continues to shape modern death care industries. Most importantly, medieval church burial demonstrated the power of religious beliefs to overcome practical obstacles and health risks. When spiritual needs were considered paramount, medieval people proved that communities will accept significant inconvenience and danger to achieve goals they consider essential for salvation and social standing. So why did medieval people bury their dead in churches? They created a theology of death that made burial location essential for salvation, while developing economic and social systems that turned death into an opportunity for displaying faith, wealth, and social status. They transformed places of worship into eternal communities that reflected earthly hierarchies, while providing spiritual comfort through proximity to sacred spaces and holy remains. They understood that death was not the end of social relationships, but their continuation in different form, requiring physical arrangements that honored both spiritual beliefs and social obligations. They developed sophisticated solutions to practical challenges, while maintaining unwavering commitment to theological principles that defined their understanding of life, death, and eternal salvation. The next time you visit a historic church or wonder about the relationship between religious belief and practical reality, remember the medieval congregation that gathered each Sunday above hundreds of graves, breathing the scent of incense and mortality, while praying for salvation in a building that was simultaneously a house of worship and city of the dead. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.